Hello, my name is Matthew Severin. I'm a product line manager for CommScope in our structural supports division. We're located in Euless, Texas, which is in between Dallas and Fort Worth. And primarily we supply steel structures both on the ground and for towers, monopoles, etc. Today I'll be discussing market trends in 2020 and beyond. And the underlying kind of theme of this is the need for wireless. So for the agenda today, we'll be taking a look at three main areas. Those will be network trends, some COVID-19 changes, and just a brief discussion of some products that we've come out in correlation to what we're seeing in the networks themselves. I'd like to start with a brief history lesson for telecoms. In 1973, the first mobile telephone call was made. That call was a point-to-point call and kind of signified the birth of a new era, if you will. For the next 30 years, we worked on launching the first generation, the first SMS text, and finally we came to 2001, which signified the launch of 3G networks. It's another 20 years later, approximately, and we've been able to launch our 5G networks. The reason that I bring this up and the reason that this is important to the current trends that we're witnessing is for 30 years, it took us to develop all the way to the 3G marker. And then for another 20 years, we were able to develop in 5G, which kind of signifies a speeding up of the time interval for deployment. And that's important because it shows that our timetables are getting faster and that the time between the launches of these generations of equipment are getting shorter and shorter. I also want to point out that in 2020, the Chinese were able to launch their first 6G satellite as a test bed for 6G networks. That's projected for about 10 years ahead of time of when it was supposed to occur. So what we're witnessing is the time frame for us of launching these different generations, again, is getting shorter and shorter, even beyond our predictions. And why this is important is because it's a key aspect when we take a look at what the overall telecommunications market is responsible for. So random access network value in 2018 was projected at $14.8 billion. In 2026, it was projected to be $44.8 billion. That's a growth of about $30 billion over a very small period of 8 years. Now, COVID-19 has kind of changed the projections of these numbers, but more so, that 30 billion represents an industry that's growing quite rapidly. Potentially one of the most rapidly growing, and is a good indication that in the future, this is going to be more important than it is now and become a pillar if it's not already considered a pillar. And we can see that in some network usage trends. So some percentages, these are just percentages that we've witnessed. These are courtesy of CTIA. 96% of adults own a mobile device. The current projections for population is somewhere around 7 to 8 billion people on the planet. So you can see that's a marked percentage of people. 80% of an estimated 240 million 911 calls were from cell phones. That trend kind of is important because it's showing that mobile phones are really more than just kind of a use as far as entertainment purposes. They're really becoming ingrained in our society. They're presenting a pathway for us beyond kind of just communication that they were initially for. And 330% growth in health and fitness apps over the past 3 years. It's a very steep mark, and in 3 years, that's a lot of growth. So these percentages are all quite large, as you can see, and they kind of pale when we compare it to some of the numbers for network usage trends. So $1.5 trillion in economic benefits from the 5G economy. That's quite a large number. That's a very high mark. $4.5 million in job creations for 5G. Again, staggering numbers there as far as what telecoms is able to provide and kind of the future of where telecoms is going. 31 billion connected devices by 2023. Very high number of connected devices, but more importantly, even beyond those numbers, which are high in and of themselves, 37 trillion megabytes of wireless traffic in 2019. That's a tremendous amount of wireless traffic. And more or less in 2019, when 5G was officially launched, and that's pre-COVID. So a remarkably high amount of data transfer occurring over wireless networks. And we see the importance of this data transfer in some interesting areas. So one of those areas is consumer concerns. If anybody's had to relocate with their family in the past, we know that the typical benchmark for relocation, the number one thing that people often talk about, is a good school system, because a good school system represents a good foundation for their family. It's an indicator of families wanting good futures for their kids. And it's been an important indicator, and an indicator that's been number one for a long time. However, this past year, we see that reliable wireless networks surpassed good schools as a primary concern for relocation. That's a huge mile marker for us to be able to, as a marketplace and as telecommunications in general, for us to be able to usurp good schools as a primary concern for relocation is actually a big indicator of the importance and the value that mobile networks and networks in general bring to the table, as far as a basis of education and even just a basis for livelihood and for life in general. So really good indication that there's a lot of market growth, and a good indication in a shift of priority. Now, we see this even more when we take a look at the impact that COVID-19 had. Before COVID-19, pre-COVID-19, workforce numbers were 12.3% for fully remote work and 8.9% for partially remote work. Now, on April 20th, 2020, we see that those numbers dramatically shifted. We see 47.7% are fully remote and 12.2% are partially remote. Throughout the year, those numbers begin to shift. And by December 15th, we see that it's 41.8% and 15%. So still significantly changed in comparison to pre-COVID numbers. And when we take a look at projections for 2021, we see that those projections show, again, a migration back towards what we would consider normal or pre-COVID numbers, but not a full return. Still 26.7% fully working at home and 15.2% working partially remote. And those are big figures. That's a quarter of our workforce, almost a third of our workforce in total, in some way or form working remote, and a quarter working full-time from home. So what this means is there were a lot of indications, there have been a lot of published articles that discuss the value of work from home and where work from home really fits into the business kind of styles of the past. And we see that that shift, that estimated shift, has occurred earlier than projections were showing, and that there is some valid proof to show that work from home is sustainable and something that definitely has positive aspects. However, working from home dramatically shifts the telecoms industry because it changes demand for services. And we can see that represented here under essential services. So in short, the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps more than any other event in human history, has demonstrated the critical importance that telecommunications infrastructure plays in keeping businesses, governments, and societies connected and running. A key aspect in general about discussing kind of network strains and trends and what we're seeing is that a lot of people focus primarily on business and working from home. However, the aspects of working from home when you're contained to your home, particularly in a COVID environment or COVID-esque environment, is that you rely on the network for a lot of things outside of just your business. You're relying on it for the social aspects. And we see that in the next statement, which is that operators were experiencing platform demand spikes as high as 800%. 800% spike in connectivity demands is unprecedented. And definitely is an indicator that the network demand is only increasing. So what was the impact of all of this? Well, obviously connectivity went to a 24/7 network requirement. While the network is available 24/7, the impact of having to operate at full potential 24/7 was something that we had potentially not witnessed yet. And it became apparent that it was going to be required of our current network. We all witnessed slow download speeds as demand increased. Cloud computing became much more important. You know, video conferencing demands a lot of cloud computing. Also, there's a decline in retail investment by companies and companies looking for external resources. Payments, virtual payments rose by as much as 67%. I think we can all say that it's fairly common now for people to not even go to the grocery store to purchase their groceries online. And this is just another indication of a higher network demand. And finally, we have security. So transaction safety and safe access to cloud resources, all of those were different areas affected by COVID. And overall, the industry as a whole, we rose to the challenge. So we remained mission critical, perhaps in the eyes of the public more important than ever before, as everybody's been leaning on networks to be their primary source of information, their primary channels to the outside world. Providing business critical connectivity and resilience, work from home arrangements. That was an interesting aspect. Work from home arrangements increased dramatically over this time. And again, getting back to that social aspect, that aspect for network use, keeping individuals and societies connected and informed with medical, financial, commercial, and other essential services during mandated social isolation. So again, that aspect that the network, not only the demand is increasing for business, but the demand is also increasing in the off time as people turn to the network during COVID as their gateway to the outside world. So why is this trend really important, and where does this take us from the aspect of structural steel? So this is important because typically technology follows a bell curve-esque shape, and that shape at the beginning of the bell curve is increasing as we start to go towards the apex, where the apex is driven by performance requirements. So technology to meet those performance requirements gets bigger, higher power consumption, et cetera, and then as it reaches those performance indicators and it meets that performance level that's required by the marketplace, we start to see on the backside more efficiencies gained, lighter, more economical. Those efficiencies are gained on the backside because they've already achieved the performance point that's required. And in response to that, particularly in the 5G network, what CommScope has done is really come out with two different variations of products. We've come out with our new Spine Apex Core, which is very focused on PIM mitigation, and our Atlas heavy-duty platform system. So our Spine, Apex, and Core utilizes three different components, and the primary reason for these three components and the change in design is really PIM mitigation. And as 5G starts to become ever more prevalent, as these densities start to increase, as we start to see new spectrum added, we know that PIM is going to become a larger and larger effector of network efficiency. So this mount system and this design is really in response to increase network efficiency by decreasing the PIM levels that are experienced by different operators in different spectrums. It does have other fringe benefits, but primarily it's to gain back those efficiencies that have been lost through PIM. And then also we have a new product for us, which is our Atlas Ultra Heavy Duty platform. So this platform was really created in response more towards the future proofing of networks and towards handling those equipment loads that are extremely large, really high amounts of EPA. And then also being able to prepare itself for kind of future development by being upgradable. So this platform really represents kind of a new way of thinking as far as an emphasis on the potential for those higher loads and future proofing or future preparing a site so that down the road, it still is able to handle whatever equipment may be coming out for the next generation. And it's kind of that thought of how are we developing our products for what could potentially lie ahead that brings me kind of towards my final slide, which is really a question of what's beyond 2021. And if we look back at that initial slide with the history lesson, we see that 6G has started to begin already, and that's scheduled ahead of when it was initially supposed to be released. So the question really remains is kind of, as we look forward, what are we going to see? what kind of technology is going to be coming out, and how is 6G going to progress in relation to other generations of telecommunications equipment that have come before. So as we look to the future, we know what we're already doing now, and it's a question of how will Apple and Google and those companies that are already starting to form alliances around the generation of 6G, what will those bring in the future, and how will we be able to react and kind of pivot to take on those challenges that lie ahead? Thank you for your time and allowing me to present